Hi, this is Sarah Butcher, and this is the Side Comment. On today's episode, Richard English discusses the effectiveness of counterterrorism efforts as a less extensively examined phenomenon. Through a series of questions, he explores why it is an important topic for us to look at in a new way that considers successes and failures. Highlighting the case studies contained within his book, Does Counterterrorism Work?, he illustrates how we can identify broader intuitions about what works well and what doesn't.
Does counterterrorism work? I'm going to ask three questions in this short talk. First, why is it an important topic for us to look at in a new way? Second, if we do explore it in a new way, how would that look in terms of closely focused case study examples? And third, what would some of the wider angle intuitions and conclusions be from such an analysis? First, responses to non-state terrorism have changed the world far more than non-state terrorism itself. And yet counter-terrorism as a phenomenon has been less carefully studied, less systematically studied, less dispassionately studied, and less successfully and extensively examined than terrorism by non-state actors. There have been many cases where people have made extravagant claims for the success of counter-terrorism, but these tend to underplay the degree to which there have been drawbacks, failures, and difficulties. And there are many cases where people have written attacking what counter-terrorists have done, but these works and commentaries tend to underplay the degree to which there are simultaneously successes. What we need is a more balanced, capacious, and inclusive way of thinking about counter-terrorism, one which accounts both for successes and for failures simultaneously. In my new book, Does Counter-Terrorism Work?, I therefore argue that we need a layered framework for understanding what working might mean. Counter-terrorism could perceivedly involve strategic victory, where you successfully eradicate terrorism or a terrorist enemy and remove the threat in a way which involves strategic success. It could involve what I call partial strategic victory, where you don't defeat your opponents, but you so contain and constrain them as to mean that terrorism is limited in its effects and therefore normal life is able to continue in substantially recognizable fashion. There could also be tactical successes, operational, in terms of publicity, in terms of undermining opponents, in terms of strengthening the state, which might or might not produce strategic success or partial strategic success, but which would themselves be particular kinds of outcome that could be pointed to as positive. And there could also be inherent rewards for people variously involved in counter-terrorism, whether this be the sense of purpose, of comradeship, of exhilaration, whether it be a greater success in one's career as a counter-terrorist professional, perhaps in terms of economic benefit, perhaps in terms of politics. If we think about those different layers of strategic, partial strategic, tactical, and inherently rewarding successes, we're likely to recognize that the question, does counter-terrorism work, is not one that can comfortingly or neatly be answered by a yes or a no, by celebration or condemnation, but which will, particularly if looked at over an historical long time period, involve complex answers which are more persuasive ultimately, even if less immediately attractive to many. Second, what does this therefore look like if you examine it against particular case studies? In my book, I look at three particular cases in depth. One is the global war on terror, which followed the atrocity of the 9/11 attacks of 2001. Here, there were some successes. ISIS, for example, was substantially degraded to such a degree that you could unquestionably see state responses by the West as being at least a partial strategic success. You could also, I think, identify partial strategic success in the ways in which for many Western states, despite the fears after 9/11, normal life was preserved in such a way as to allow it to continue recognizably. Despite these many tactical successes which contributed to partial strategic outcomes, I think there were also tremendous drawbacks to what happened, and that negative aspect needs to be addressed as well. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was cast very much as an example of something that was justified as counterterrorism, and yet it exaggerated the threat of what was coming from Iraq, and indeed increased the threat of terrorism within and beyond Iraq in response to that ill-judged intervention. In Afghanistan, after 20 years, the Taliban actually returned to power in ways which marked a strategic failure for the United States and its allies. In that sense, not only was there not strategic victory in the war on terror, there wasn't the eradication of terrorism that was promised by people early after 2001 saw the terrible attacks of 9/11. There were also damaging aspects done even at the partially strategic or tactical level in ways which remain very problematic for those involved in the war on terror. A very different example is that of Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Again, there were failures in counter-terrorism. In the early years in particular, the heavy-handedness of British military response was not only the cause of terrible suffering for those on the receiving end of it, but was also something which caused blowback and increased the terrorism that was arising from groups like the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. And yet in the end in Northern Ireland, while terrorism was not entirely removed, it was contained and constrained. It was thwarted. Most terrorist operations were being prevented before they occurred. Terrorist organisations were heavily infiltrated and undermined and degraded. And this containment helped to persuade the leaderships of terrorist groups that their violence was not bringing the victory that they had sought and expected, and therefore persuaded them to become involved in the inclusive peace process negotiations which ended up generating the 1998 Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and which, together with other innovations in the peace process, overwhelmingly removed most terrorist violence from the north of Ireland. The third example I look at is that of Israel-Palestine, where you frequently found something different again, often very high success at tactical level, operationally, a lot of skill, a lot of ingenuity, and a lot of life-saving work by the Israeli state. And yet at the strategic level, there has not been a capacity to remove the problems from which the terrorism continually emerges. If we look at the recent tragedy in Israel-Palestine, we see that not only on October the 7th was there a failure of tactical counter-terrorism by Israel, which allowed for that awful attack to occur, but the response of the Israeli state is something which has neither finally removed Hamas from politics in the region, nor has it advantaged Israel in terms of popular international opinion and standing. Arguably, what is required in Israel-Palestine is something more akin to what happened in Northern Ireland, where tactical containment of terrorist groups is combined with an attempt strategically to produce a deal which, while not removing all terrorism, will limit its incidence and will have life-saving consequences for many people. In conclusion, when we look at counter-terrorism in a frameworked way such as I'm arguing, if we include the successes and the failures, the tactical, the inherently rewarding, as well as the strategic, are there broader intuitions about what works well and what does not? I think that there are. One aspect of it is the need to set realistic goals and consistently pursue them. Repeatedly, whether it's the war on terror, Israel dealing with Palestinian terrorism, or British governments dealing with terrorism in Northern Ireland, people set an exaggerated definition of what success would look like. Getting rid of all terrorism, which is unrealistic. Containment is much more plausible, and containment would produce a huge success. It's important that counter-terrorism is ethical counter-terrorist behaviour. Again and again in my book, Does Counter-Terrorism Work? It's shown that counter-terrorism is more effective the more ethical it is. This has implications, for example, with how we treat prisoners. It has implications, for example, in how we think about torture, both unethical and counterproductive. And it's absolutely crucial also that the state should think about coordinating those different ways in which state to state or intrastate, different wings of the same state operate, so that counterterrorism is considered to be something which over the longer term can be coordinated in the way that best saves life and limb. I argue therefore for a new and more systematic and more balanced way of trying to understand counterterrorism. I look at it through various case studies, and I try to produce intuitions and inferences which are of wide-angled relevance, both analytically for academics and scholars, but I think in terms of citizens, in terms of policymakers, in terms of governments, and in terms of all of us. Counterterrorism is far too important a phenomenon globally for us to treat it casually. We need to understand it in a historically minded and carefully considered way. If we do so, we have the best chance of limiting the incidence of horrific terrorist violence in the future.